The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The disciples told their story of what had happened on the road and how they recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And they were still talking about all this when Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." In a state of alarm and fright, they thought they were seeing a ghost. But he said, "Why are you agitated? And why are these doubts rising in your hearts? Look at my hands and feet. Yes, it is I indeed. Touch me and see for yourself. A ghost has no flesh and bones, as you can see I have." And as he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Their joy was great, that they still could not believe it. And they stood there dumbfounded. So he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" And they offered him a piece of grilled fish, which he took and ate before their eyes. And then he told them, "This is what I meant when I said, while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms had to be fulfilled." He then opened their mind to understand the scriptures. And he said to them, "So you see how it was written that the Christ would suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and that in his name repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be preached to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses to this." The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So we're meeting the disciples in the upper room. And here we have those two who had gone to Emmaus, encountered him on the way, coming back to Jerusalem. They were distracted from their mission. They left the mission, which was Jerusalem, and headed out, encountered Christ, come back to mission, and regroup again now with all the disciples. And so they're all there in the upper room. They're meeting and recounting stories of how Jesus had appeared to them. And I want you to hear that, because that's what the upper room was filled with. Lots of recounting of the encounters with Jesus. Lots of recounting of what Jesus said and did, but mainly of what he said and did as a risen Christ to them. So now that they're recounting and they're still speaking, Jesus stands there and he says, "Peace be with you." Now, we hear that and we respond so easily, "and with your spirit." And yes, it means something, but the full weight of the greeting is lost because we use it so easily and so often. In the Mass, a priest would say, "The Lord be with you." The bishop will say, "Peace be with you." And there's a difference in the greeting. Peace is shalom. Shalom is the restoration of all relationship. Shalom is putting back right your relationship with God, your relationship with your neighbor, your relationship with the creation, and your relationship with the self. And this greeting of shalom, this gift of shalom that Jesus is giving to his people, is a gift that he gives to you today. Shalom, peace be with you. In giving this gift of peace, what he's saying is that what I have achieved in my death and resurrection is a gift that I give to you, and that is reconciliation with God, with neighbor, with self, with creation. And that reconciliation brings us back to that place that Adam and Eve were in before the garden, before the fall, before they had disobeyed God. They lived in a complete state of peace. And we are intended to live in a complete state of peace. Does it feel like that in your life right now? Do you feel that peace? I am sure not. With the fear, with the this, with the that. But that's where the disciples were in the upper room. They were in fear. They were in disbelief. They were in doubt. They were confused. They couldn't understand. They couldn't put it together in their head. That's where they were. So let's journey with them a little bit more. After he gives them his gift of peace, he says, why are these doubts rising in your hearts? Look at your hands. Look at your feet. Yes, it is me indeed. And so he shows them his hands and his feet. He's saying to them, this is not a ghost. I am here. I have risen. And now we know from this text that the resurrection is bodily. He says, touch my hands, touch my feet. And in this second move in our text, first the gift of peace, now the touching of the hands and the feet, he's saying that I have a real body. And they still can't get it. And so then after showing them the hands and the feet, he says, look, you have anything to eat? So they bring some fish. So he eats some fish. He's demonstrating to the disciples that his body is a real body. This is not a hologram. This is not an illusion. This is not some sci-fi makeup where he was put in there, but if you try to put your hand in, it goes through. This is not a ghost. And that's why the church says we believe in the resurrection of the body. Because Jesus' resurrection is a bodily resurrection. In the next part of the text, what we see here, which is echoed in the first reading, is that the early church had to learn how to interpret all the events of Jesus through the scriptures, in their case, through the Old Testament. And what is referred to here, he says, and this is what I meant when I was with you, and while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms has to be fulfilled. Because for the Jew at that time, the whole of the Old Testament was the law of Moses, the prophets, and the writings, or the Psalms. And these three parts of the Old Testament refer to the whole of the text. So everything written in the whole of the Old Testament refers back to me. And you see in the first reading, that's what Peter is doing, reinterpreting the promise to Abraham, reinterpreting the Old Testament to show how it all speaks to Jesus Christ. And that's why every day we're given texts. And on a Sunday, you have an Old Testament reading and a gospel reading to show how the Old Testament points back to the Christ. But here we have another clue that is important. So you now can see how it is written that the Christ would suffer, and on the third day he would rise from the dead, and that in his name repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be preached to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses to this. That repentance, the whole of the scriptures, speaks to the Christ, and now we are called to preach repentance in his name. And what is repentance? Repentance, metanoia, turning your life around. It is about the reintegration of your life in right relationship with God, right relationship with your neighbor, right relationship with the creation and yourself. This metanoia, this repentance, this turning around is to put yourself back in right relationship in these four fundamental relationships. He starts by giving it to them, and then he says at the end, this is what you are to proclaim. This peace that I have given to you, this is the proclamation that God calls all people to be reconciled to himself. Are you reconciled to God? Is your life right with God? Is your life right with your neighbor? Is your life right with the creation? Are you right with yourself, with your conscience? Are you? Because this is the proclamation. And this is the ultimate proclamation that Jesus gives to them in the upper room. Make your life right with God, with neighbor, with self, with creation. And how do we do that? By understanding that he has already given to us that gift of reconciliation and peace through the death on the cross and through his love in the resurrection.